In medieval Europe, winter wasn't a season, it was a threat. When the first snow fell, you weren't thinking about comfort. You were thinking about survival. No grocery stores, no heating, no backup plan. If your family didn't have the right knowledge, the cold simply erased you. Modern preppers rely on gear, gadgets, and YouTube tutorials, but medieval peasants? They had something far more powerful: centuries of brutal, hard-earned wisdom. Skills so strange, so ingenious, and so forgotten that most of us today wouldn't even recognize them as technology. Yet these were the very tricks that kept people alive when failure meant starvation, frostbite, or death in the dark. And the craziest part? They could do things with trees, rocks, ash, and plants that modern survival experts with full backpacks still struggle to replicate. Today, we're uncovering 7 medieval survival techniques so effective, so shockingly clever, that they didn't just help peasants endure winter, they gave them a fighting chance against a world designed to kill the unprepared. When we imagine medieval Europe, we often picture bustling markets, hearty stews, and wooden tables piled with bread. But during the Great Famine of 1315, that image couldn't have been further from reality. Grain stores emptied, livestock starved, entire harvests failed under relentless rain and cold. And for millions of families, survival suddenly depended on something almost unthinkable to us today: eating trees. Yes, trees. Not the leaves, not the fruit, the inner bark. To a medieval peasant, the forest was more than a backdrop. It was the last emergency pantry when every other option dried up. And deep inside pine and birch trees, beneath the rough exterior, lay a thin, cream-colored layer called the cambium. Soft, slightly sweet, and packed with carbohydrates, minerals, and just enough vitamin C to keep scurvy away. But this wasn't a desperate, grab anything and chew it kind of trick. This was a refined survival technique passed down through generations, each mistake paid for in hunger, illness, or death. Families would search for trees at precisely the right age. Too young, and the sap could be toxic. Too old, and the bark turned into something tougher than boiled leather. Knowledge mattered, down to the season. Early spring was the golden hour of survival. As the sap flowed upward, the inner bark loosened, making it easier to peel and far more nutritious. Using bone scrapers, wooden wedges, or any tool they had, villagers carved vertical lines down the trunk and carefully peeled away long strips. But they followed one rule religiously: never cut all the way around. One full ring of missing bark killed the tree, and killing the tree meant killing next year's food supply. Once harvested, the bark went through a process that combined patience with primitive but surprisingly effective technology. Families laid the strips on heated stones beside the fire, turning them over and over until they crisped into brittle sheets. These were ground for hours using hand-operated querns, 2 circular stones that crushed the dried bark into a coarse, resin-scented flour. The texture was harsh, the smell sharp, and the taste, honestly terrible. Medieval accounts describe it tasting like a mix of pine smoke, dirt, and bitterness strong enough to make children gag. But when the alternative was starvation, taste didn't matter. Life did. Most households mixed 1 part bark flour with 3 parts whatever grain they still had left, rye, barley, or oats if they were lucky, to create a heavy, dark loaf. It wasn't delicious, it wasn't comforting, but it delivered energy, vitamins, and, most importantly, hope. Monasteries even kept notes comparing different tree types. Birch produced a milder flavor, pine was intensely resinous, and oak required boiling to remove toxins. Some families stretched the recipe further by adding dried berries or ground acorns, turning desperation into a kind of crude, rustic science. Bark bread wasn't a symbol of failure, it was a symbol of endurance. A reminder that when nature turned vicious and food vanished, medieval people didn't give up. They adapted with intelligence, ingenuity, and a kind of rugged creativity we rarely give them credit for today. If bark bread kept medieval people fed, rope kept their entire world functioning. In a time without hardware stores or manufactured cordage, rope wasn't a tool, it was a lifeline. It held shelters together, tied livestock, bundled harvests, secured fishing traps, carried water buckets, repaired carts, and even played a role in battlefield emergencies. And the most astonishing part? A medieval peasant could walk into a meadow with empty hands and walk out with 50 feet of reliable rope. Their secret was mastering the plants around them. Nettle, the same stinging nettle we avoid today, was one of the most prized cordage materials in Europe. Harvested in late summer, when the fibers reached peak strength, nettles produced strands tougher than modern hemp. Villagers cut the stems, soaked them in streams for weeks until the outer layers rotted away, then separated the strong, silky inner fibers with practiced hands. Willow bark was another masterpiece of medieval engineering. Peeled in early spring while the sap was flowing, the long, flexible strips were twisted immediately while still green. As the bark dried, the rope didn't weaken, it tightened. The fibers constricted around each other and formed cordage that could last for decades. And in sieges, when no plants were left to harvest, medieval defenders turned to something even more personal: their own hair. Chronicles describe women and men braiding strands together, adding new lengths as they worked, creating makeshift lifelines strong enough to haul up food or lower messages down castle walls under enemy fire. It wasn't pretty, but it saved lives. What made medieval rope truly remarkable wasn't just the materials, it was the technique. Rope makers understood opposing tension, a principle many modern people never learn. They twisted individual fibers in one direction, while twisting the combined strands in the opposite direction. This created a structural lock. The harder you pulled, the tighter the rope held. No machines, no metal tools, just pure tactile knowledge. In some regions, rope making was almost ceremonial. Families tested fibers by snapping them between their fingers or listening for a crisp, musical ping when stretched. Children learned to roll fibers across their thighs with quick, rhythmic motions. Adults memorized which plants made flexible cordage, which made rigid lines, and which should never be used near fire. To modern eyes, a rope is just a rope, but to medieval people, it was the backbone of daily life, proof that survival wasn't about brute strength, but about understanding how to transform the natural world into tools of resilience. When medieval crops failed, and they often did, the forest stopped being scenery and became the only place where families could still find calories. But unlike modern hikers who wander through the woods hoping to recognize something edible, medieval foragers walked with certainty. They carried centuries of ecological knowledge in their heads: which plants emerged first after snowmelt, which roots hid underground during freezes, which branches held insects rich in protein, and which nuts delivered the fats needed to survive long winters. To them, the wilderness wasn't wild. It was organized, predictable, and full of opportunity, if you knew what to look for. Their food-gathering methods were astonishingly systematic. Medieval fishing alone shows a level of ingenuity most survivalists today rarely match. Instead of relying on luck, they crafted bone hooks heated over fire and bent into perfect curves. They carved wooden lures shaped to mimic local fish species. And, most impressively, they built fish weirs, woven underwater fences placed in streams and rivers that guided fish into natural holding chambers. Set them up correctly, and they could catch dozens of fish overnight with no supervision. It was passive income, medieval style. Foraging plants required an even deeper understanding of timing and chemistry. Spring shoots delivered vitamin C that prevented scurvy. Summer berries supplied quick sugars. Fall nuts, especially hazelnuts and chestnuts, provided the dense fats people needed to endure freezing temperatures. Roots like burdock, parsnip, and cattail could be eaten raw or roasted, while others required special preparation to remove toxins. Acorns were a perfect example. Raw acorns are painfully bitter and filled with tannins. But medieval foragers transformed them through a precise process of leaching. crushing, soaking, rinsing, and repeating until the water ran clear. The result was a nut flour that could stretch precious grain or be formed into dense, long-lasting cakes. Wild meat preservation didn't require salt or fancy equipment. Medieval people knew how to harness the landscape itself. They positioned thin strips of meat in natural wind corridors or hung them near controlled fires that produced the right amount of smoke. Certain herbs, juniper, sage, alder, weren't chosen for flavor alone. Their smoke contained antimicrobial compounds that slowed spoilage and protected the meat for months. And the knowledge ran even deeper. Medieval families learned to watch the behavior of animals to locate seasonal food sources. Birds revealed where berries ripened earliest. Squirrels pointed toward hidden nut caches. Even insects played a role. Ants often led foragers to edible roots or rotting logs full of protein-rich grubs. But here's the most surprising part. Many villages maintained oral foraging calendars, songs, rhymes, or carved wooden sticks with markings that corresponded to each plant's peak season. Children memorized them the way modern kids memorize alphabet songs. This wasn't random wandering. It was structured survival science, passed down without books, classrooms, or laboratories. To modern eyes, a forest is unpredictable. But to medieval people, it was a living map, one they knew so intimately that even in the worst years, they could feed their families from land that would leave most of us starving within days. In the medieval world, you didn't survive because you had the right gear. You survived because you knew how to make the right gear, anytime, anywhere. A medieval peasant could step into a forest empty-handed and walk out with a full toolkit: cutting blades, containers, needles, fishing gear, even weapons. To them, nature wasn't an obstacle. It was an endless toolbox waiting to be unlocked. Their process began with understanding raw materials on a level that feels almost supernatural today. They could identify stones suitable for blades, flint, chert, obsidian, simply by weight, sound, and the way light reflected off the surface. These stones weren't shaped by guesswork. Craftsmen practiced controlled fracturing, striking the edges at precise angles until a razor-sharp blade emerged. Some were so sharp that modern archaeologists compare them to surgical scalpels. But a blade wasn't truly useful until it had a proper handle. Medieval toolmakers split green wood, slid the blade inside, and bound everything using sinew or rawhide. As the material dried, it shrank and tightened, locking the blade in place without a single drop of glue. It was natural engineering, simple, elegant, and incredibly durable. Bones from hunted animals became another treasure. Long bones turned into awls and needles. Fish bones created delicate tools perfect for fine crafting. Antlers were shaped into handles or sturdy cutting edges. Nothing went to waste. Every part of an animal had a second life. Containers were just as remarkable. Birch bark, peeled in wide, clean sheets, could be folded into waterproof cups and storage vessels using nothing but clever creasing and tight stitching. Clay pots were fired in open pits, where medieval potters controlled airflow and temperature with the precision of chemists. They knew which deposits cracked, which held shape, and which produced vessels strong enough for cooking over open flames. What made all of this even more impressive was the speed. A practiced craftsman could make a functional knife in under an hour, a fishing spear in half a day, or a full set of cooking vessels in a weekend. They weren't improvising. They were following techniques refined across generations. To us, the wilderness feels empty, but to medieval people, it was a workshop with no walls, full of materials, full of solutions, full of possibilities. And the only limit was their knowledge. If hunger threatened medieval families slowly, cold threatened them instantly. In a world without insulated jackets, central heating, or weather forecasts, winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a killer. A single night of freezing temperatures could end lives, and everyone knew it. That's why medieval survival wasn't just about food. It was about mastering warmth, shelter, and the unpredictable forces of nature. Fire came first. Not just any fire, reliable fire.
Medieval people knew that rain, wind, or wet fuel could mean the difference between life and frostbite, so they used fat wood, resin-rich pine taken from the heart of dead branches. Even water couldn't extinguish its flame. By shaving it into delicate curls, then layering thicker shavings beneath, they created tinder bundles that ignited quickly and burned hot. They prepared different tinder qualities: ultrafine shavings for damp mornings, birch bark for fast ignition, and dry grass for steady flames. This wasn't just lighting a fire, it was a formula, but even the strongest fire couldn't protect a family sleeping in the open. That's why medieval shelters were marvels of natural engineering. Many communities built earth shelters, digging into hillsides or soft soil to create insulated underground homes. These structures took advantage of a simple truth: below ground, temperature stays stable, cool in summer, warm in winter. Families lined the walls with woven branches, moss, clay, and even animal hides. With a small fire burning inside, these shelters stayed warm enough to keep frost at bay even during blizzards. Clothing became a second layer of survival. Instead of modern synthetic jackets, medieval people relied on a precise layering system: soft animal fur against the skin to trap heat, bundles of dried grass for bulk insulation, and outer garments made from tightly woven plant fibers that repelled snow and allowed moisture to escape. It wasn't fashionable, but it kept people alive. And then there was weather prediction. Without meteorologists or satellites, medieval people learned to read the sky with eerie accuracy. A sudden shift in wind direction meant a storm within hours. Low-flying birds signaled falling air pressure. Unusual silence in forests often meant heavy snowfall approaching. These weren't superstitions. They were field-tested observations. When your life depends on the weather, you become an expert whether you like it or not. Some families took shelter design even further. They oriented entrances away from prevailing winds. They created smoke vents that doubled as passive heat circulators. They placed sleeping areas on raised mounds of straw so no one touched the cold ground. Everything had purpose. Everything followed experience. To us, warmth is a switch on the wall. To them, warmth was strategy, knowledge, and constant vigilance. Medieval people didn't just endure winter, they outsmarted it. With fire, earth, and ingenuity sharpened by generations of survival. If there's one medieval resource we completely underestimate today, it's ash. Modern people sweep it away, dump it, or forget about it entirely. But to a medieval household, ash wasn't waste. It was chemistry, it was medicine, it was cleaning supply, food processing agent, and even part of early industry. Every home had an ash keeper, someone who knew exactly which wood produced which type of ash, and how each type could be used without causing harm. Oak, for example, created a powerful alkaline ash perfect for making soap. But if you use that same ash in food preparation, you could burn your mouth or poison your family. Beech ash, on the other hand, was gentle enough to clarify honey or neutralize acidic foods. Vine ash, produced from burnt grapevines, had such a unique mineral profile that it became a medieval toothpaste, capable of polishing enamel and preventing decay better than most remedies at the time. Ash production wasn't as simple as burning wood and collecting the leftovers. Medieval ash makers understood that to produce safe, consistent ash, the wood had to burn completely, down to a fine white powder with almost no charcoal. They controlled airflow, stacking wood in ways that encouraged full combustion and maintained steady heat. Too much air created charcoal. Too little air trapped harmful compounds. This intuitive chemistry was passed down like a family secret. Once collected, ash became the base for lye, the crucial ingredient in soap. But medieval workers didn't have pH meters or scientific instruments. They tested the strength of lye using a floating egg. If the egg floated high, the mixture was too strong. If it sank, too weak. Only when it hovered just right, suspended between sinking and floating, did they know the lye was safe to combine with animal fats. Soap making was delicate work. Too much lye, and the soap burned skin. Too little, and it wouldn't clean. But medieval soap makers mastered this balance by feel, smell, texture, and color. They produced bars tough enough to cut grease, but gentle enough for their own hands. And ash wasn't just for cleanliness. Healers used it to treat wounds, mixing specific ash types with honey and water to create antimicrobial pastes. Farmers used ash to enrich acidic soils. Food workers used it to preserve meats or soften tough grains. Even metal workers used ash in early smelting processes to control impurities. Some villages treated ash like currency. Families traded oak ash for beech ash, or vine ash for fruitwood ash, depending on what they needed that season. Entire survival strategies revolved around knowing which trees produced what. To us, ash is just the remains of a fire. To medieval people, ash was a toolkit, one that cleaned, healed, preserved, strengthened, and solved problems long before chemistry had a name. When we look back at medieval survival techniques, it's tempting to see them as clever tricks or fascinating curiosities, things people did back then because they didn't know better. But the truth is far more sobering. These skills weren't optional, they weren't hobbies. They were lifelines, carved into memory through generations of desperation, loss, and hard-earned experience. Every technique we've explored, bark bread, rope making, wilderness foraging, tool crafting, shelter engineering, ash chemistry, came from a long chain of trial and error where every error carried a price. If you harvested the wrong tree bark, your family got sick. If you twisted rope incorrectly, it snapped at the worst moment. If you misread the weather, your shelter failed and someone didn't wake up. If you made lye too strong, you could blind yourself. There was no margin for sloppiness, no safety nets, no hospital to fix your mistakes. Modern survivalists talk about self-reliance, but medieval people embodied it in the most literal sense. Their knowledge wasn't written in books. They carried it in their bones, passed down through storytelling around fires, through demonstrations in fields and forests, through repetition until the motions became instinct. Children grew up watching their parents scrape bark, twist fibers, test fish traps, shape flint blades, and tend fires in the rain. By the time they were adults, these skills weren't lessons, they were reflexes. And what's most striking is how scientific medieval wisdom really was. They observed patterns in plants, animals, soil, and weather with a precision modern people rarely match. They had no microscopes, no thermometers, no satellite data. Yet they predicted storms, preserved food, crafted tools, and maintained stable homes using knowledge accumulated across centuries. Knowledge that's easy for us to dismiss because it doesn't come wrapped in technology. But imagine losing electricity for a month. No refrigerator, no stores, no running water, no GPS. Suddenly, those medieval tricks don't look like relics. They look like the difference between coping and collapsing. And that's the real value of exploring these forgotten survival skills. They remind us that human ingenuity didn't begin in labs or factories. It began in forests, rivers, mountains, and fields. It began with people who didn't have the luxury of guessing. People who had to understand the natural world intimately or die trying. Their world was harsh, unforgiving, and brutally simple. If you didn't know how to survive, you didn't. So here's the question. Which of these skills would you trust with your life? If you had to survive one medieval winter on your own. Surviving the medieval world wasn't about strength, luck, or gear. It was about knowledge. Practical, brutal, and passed down through generations like a torch in the dark. And even though we live with modern comforts, it's hard not to wonder. How long would any of us last if we had to face a single medieval winter? If this journey into forgotten survival skills opened your eyes, make sure to subscribe. There's a whole world of ancient wisdom still waiting to be rediscovered. And before you go, tell me in the comments, which one of these skills would you want to master first? Your answer might just reveal how well you'd survive when the world gets cold.